Welcome back to the Bourbon Lens with your host, Jake. I am traveling and I left Scott at home. I'm in Denver, but we're excited. In this week's episode, we are going to feature a brand that has been on previously, whether Instagram Live or on the podcast, which is Keeper's Heart. And we're going to be discussing innovation and what's happening in and around Minneapolis because they got a lot of irons in the fire, and we're excited for having Brian Nation back on with us to talk everything Keeper's Heart and O'Shaughnessy Distilling. So sit back and buckle in and listen to our newest episode featuring Keeper's Heart. Brian, how's it going, man?
Fantastic. Great to be back on the show.
Yeah, man, it's great. We were just catching up beforehand, and it's been a couple years since we had sat down, and the last time we shared a dram was over St. Patrick's Day to celebrate the patron saint, St. Patrick, right?
It's amazing how time flies. I mean, 2 years since we discussed, and by God, has it been a busy 2 years.
Man, it has been. There's been a lot of cool innovation, right? I think the last time we talked, the Irish American was still kind of the main part of the portfolio. Mm-hmm. And since then you've evolved, right? You have the Irish bourbon. And then you've added different release points of that. So we'll talk about that here in a second, but I think just for our listeners, what's happening at O'Shaughnessy? Because it seems like I continue to see it swell. It keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And one way it's gotten big is you all have partnered with one of the biggest sports names in commentary, and Dan Patrick. Like, what's been that like to see, that relationship and that, growth there from that perspective?
That, to your point, for a brand our size, we seem to have been punching well above our weight, which is something that we're really proud of and really excited about, because we've garnered a lot of interest around the US in terms of what we're doing at the distillery, but also in terms of our whole branding and the whole story behind everything that we're doing. And part of that, led us to partnering with Dan Patrick, the Dan Patrick Show. And that has been an amazing opportunity for us because it gets our story out there to a wider audience that probably we wouldn't be able to do on our own, to be honest.
Yeah.
So when we met Patrick last year and the Nets, we kind of presented our story, we presented our liquid, and they were really intrigued, as were we, because we were very interested as to why did they kind of even attempt to have a conversation with us on this, because we were such a new brand. But one of the things that we kind of got from the conversation was that both of us were kind of had a similar story, in that Dan left an amazing role in ESPN, and then obviously set up his own business and ultimately became so successful as he is today. And he was looking at, the people that were involved in our team in Keeper's Heart and the businesses that we left to be involved in this. And he just thought there was a nice synergy there. And then I think one of the big things for us was that we really hit it off when we met. We felt we could build and forge a great relationship and have fun along the way. And I think we've succeeded in doing that over the last 12 months. And it has been great because we've got opportunities to be involved with a sports show that we probably didn't think we would be involved in.
Yeah, exactly.
12 months or 18 months ago. And also we've had opportunities to be, forefront of, we'll call the American football game between Notre Dame and the Navy back in Ireland.
Yeah.
And also we were involved in look-ins at the Super Bowl the week before the Super Bowl in Vegas. So opportunities that we didn't think we'd have, and have just been great for Keeper's Heart, and they've brought the message and the story to a wider audience.
Yeah, no, I literally, it was like, I tuned in to the Dan Patrick Show and I was like, holy shit. Like that was kind of my reaction. I was like, cause I didn't see anything come out, and I was like, that's pretty cool. And then like, I kept seeing it and I was like, man, that's pretty sweet that they have that deal. And it's, it's a unique parallel, right? Because he was at his top of his game at ESPN. Like, they had a new boss, things came in, things changed a little bit, but I mean, he could have still been a lead sports anchor. And he made that choice. And same thing with your story, right? You could have still been crushing it at Irish Distillers, right? Like you could still be pumping out Jameson and all the other brands in between, but you have, made your path in your own way. And that's pretty cool. And it's fun to see whiskey intersect with sports, just in general, like as a sports lover myself.
It actually is. It actually is. And, I think the other side of it too for us is that it gives us a platform to show as well that we want to have a bit of fun. I mean, one of the things for us is to show people that whiskey isn't that scary, isn't that kind of a difficult drink to enjoy or to experiment with. And, we encourage people to have fun responsibly along the way, but we're having fun while we're doing it. So why shouldn't people that drink our whiskey have fun and enjoy it along the way as well?
Yeah, I mean, I'm all for having fun responsibly, because that's what it's all about, right? You want to share those experiences, you want to be able to have that story, and you want to be able to create those special moments, right? Like how special of a moment was to be like, hey, Notre Dame playing Navy back in Ireland, like. That's pretty cool. And there's an Irish American whiskey that you all can celebrate with. Like, how uniquely Irish is that?
Oh, absolutely. And to get the opportunity to share that experience with the team, with our own team and the Dan Patrick team, and also have Will Ferrell come with us as well for that week was just something that kind of dreams are made of, and something that you certainly didn't plan out at the start of the year that this is what was going to happen. But, you take those opportunities as they come by and you make the most of them. And again, we built a great relationship with the team in Ireland that time. And that relationship has continued to blossom and develop. And, it's one of the reasons that Dan Patrick was here in St. Paul and Minneapolis for St. Patrick's Day and was actually the Grand Marshal for our St. Patrick's Day parade. And, that type of relationship and that type of opportunity has just been amazing for us. And sometimes you begin to pinch yourself and say, it's Keeper's Heart. It's a brand that's beginning to grow, but it's still very, very small. And to be able to be involved in opportunities like this is something that's quite humbling, but also something that we say, obviously people are taking some bit of notice of our brand and it has that opportunity and people believe in what we're doing.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a ton of sense. And you talked about the brand and it beginning to take off and the size of it, right? You all kind of started with this vision of taking Irish and American rye whiskey and blending them together to make, your first release. And now you've taken, your heritage Irish spirit and mixed that with the heritage American spirit and bourbon, right? To create Irish bourbon, experience. What's it been like to continue to bring that evolution of Irish right? Because a lot of Americans, if you go back as a melting pot, have some Irish descent, along the way. So like, your whiskey is a melting pot for a lot of families that if they could understand the concept, might be able to get behind it pretty easily.
Yeah. And I think to your point is that, when we set out on this whole operation and this whole project, it was all around bringing the best of both Irish and American distilling traditions together. So we're doing that in two key ways. One is what you see is the whiskies that we've released today, which is bringing, the best of Irish style of whiskey and blending it with American style whiskey. So as you said, our first release was the Irish plus American, which blended the Irish pot still, the Irish grain whiskey with an American rye whiskey, all 4-year-old whiskies. And what it delivered was an extra dimension of flavor, taste, complexity, and balance that you wouldn't get with 100% Irish or 100% American. I think one of the things that when you set out and do something like this is that it's very important for people to taste that whiskey because it's such a new style. It's such a new, almost like a new category. And when you're looking at that, you do want people to taste it. You want people to experience what we talk about because, it's very easy for me to stand there and talk about an extra dimensional flavor of taste. The proof is in the pudding. The proof is in the tasting.
Yeah.
So we do a lot of demos and tasting like that. When it came to doing the Irish plus bourbon, what we saw the opportunity for the Irish plus bourbon was to really make the whiskey intentionally forward whiskey in order to entice more American whiskey drinkers over to this style or this category. We always felt that the Irish plus American was more of a nod towards the Irish style. Whereas with the Irish plus bourbon, we wanted to make it more that nod towards the American whiskey. And what you find with the Irish plus bourbon, which is totally different from the Irish American, is that you tend to get the influence of the Irish pot still more on the taste than on the nose. But when you do get that influx of the Irish pot still coming through on the flavor profile within the taste, it really does give you an experience that you would never ever dream of getting in terms of that you get from a bourbon whiskey. And like we talk about it being, the richness of an Irish pot still coupled with the spiciness of a rye, or the richness of an Irish pot still coupled with the boldness of a bourbon. And they really do deliver on that type of style and that type of flavor profile, and are so different from your 100% Irish or your 100% American whiskeys.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's
sorry, yeah.
Oh no, that's what I was going to say is like, I have the Irish bourbon like in my glass right now, and that's what I was getting off right off the bat was it's hidden beneath the Irish didn't show up until my palate, and then I could taste a little bit of the pot. Does it have the Irish grain as well?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what I thought. Like you can tell like Irish grain whiskey to me has a very distinct taste, back palate that's kind of sharp. It's not a bad thing. It's just got a sharpness to it. And like, that's where it showed up was like back palate, that kind of grain sharpness showed, but like you still get the caramels, the vanillas, the oaks, and that's all in the nose. Really traditional from that sense, but it's like the sharpness and the oiliness that you get from the Irish pot still and the Irish grain show up in the back part of the palate for me.
Yeah. And I think your comment on the oiliness there, what for me is when the experience you get as you begin to taste the Irish plus bourbon is that oiliness of the pot still and the herbal earthiness of the pot still almost elongates the finish, but it also does something to bring down the level of pepperiness of the bourbon, but still give all of the flavor and all of the impact of a bourbon without that same level of pepperiness coming through from that virgin American oak. Mm-hmm. So I think you're getting a combination of additional flavor, but you're also getting some of the pepperiness a little bit muted, but not taking away any of the flavor of the bourbon.
Mm-hmm. I'm right there with you. It was kind of one of those things that like, there's so many different varieties of Irish whiskey, right? We talked about this last time, but you have Irish whiskey, then you have single pot still, you have single grain, you have single malt, and I know I'm missing some in here. And so those are the three that I can confidently say that I know correctly. And they each have very unique taste and flavor profiles that you get where like bourbon is made a certain way, and it it's your mash bill. You're doing whatever you want with it. And in the grain with the Irish grain whiskey would probably match up to that, most closely because it's kind of taking a mash process, but it produces so many different esters and so many different congeners that the flavor profiles are completely different, which I think is really unique when you pair that American style to what international grain whiskey is and how they kind of meld together. That's where I think a unique story lies in this whiskey, to me personally. Through all those different whiskeys, like in the different styles, right? There's also different ways of making whiskey, right? Because there's different pot stills, there's different ways that shows up. And you've had experience working with all styles of Irish whiskey, right? So when you're putting those together and with your previous history there, did you think this would work the way it did? Or did you kind of like have to do multiple iterations to kind of land on the right ratio to make it happen correctly?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I worked on it when we were putting the Irish and American whiskey together. I was doing that in Ireland because it was during COVID time, so couldn't travel to the US. And I started with between 130 and 140 different prototypes. And some of that was down to not knowing whether I would use a malt whiskey, even looked at using a bit of peated Irish malt whiskey, looking at different styles. But one of the things that I also thought that would happen in the blend was I would use only a pot still or a malt whiskey and a rye whiskey or a bourbon whiskey. I hadn't any intention of using any grain whiskey, to be honest. But what I did find was that no matter what you did, you couldn't get the two of them, the two powerhouses, as I call them, of the Irish style and the American style to actually coexist. They were competing against each other in all different types of splits in terms of composition. And it was only with the introduction of a small amount of grain whiskey, it actually allowed the two of the powerhouses to coexist And it also, by virtue of doing that, it developed a balance, but also allowed the complexity of the whiskey to actually develop as well. And that was a big learning curve for me in terms of the use of the grain whiskey, because my initial idea was just use a pot still or a malt whiskey or and a rye or a bourbon whiskey.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense, right? To be able to balance it out appropriately, it needed that zip, right? It needed that the levity, because the oiliness probably, it's pot still, and your bourbon's probably column still, right? Like, that's going to be a lot different meshing point, but being able to add that zip of that grain makes a ton of sense to be able to round out the complexities. And not only did you start with, I think it's 92 proof, right? So
the Irish plus American is 86, then the Irish plus bourbon is 92 proof.
Yeah. So in the bourbon, right, which came later, you also added the bourbon nerd's favorite thing, or aficionado, or bourbon connoisseur, right? The higher proof whiskey, right? So I think 118. Yeah. Now, was it harder to play with that? Because a lot of times the Irish whiskeys are a lot more delicate, right? And you don't see a lot of high proof Irish or Scottish whiskey in general, right? That's just not a thing. So when you went there, how did that change the way you looked at, creating that blend altogether? Or did it just make sense?
Well, to be honest, we actually didn't adjust the blend at all, which was something that really surprised me, to your point, in terms of with the amount of Irish whiskey that's in there. Would we get the same level of flavor? Not so much the same level, but would we get a development of the flavor profile in the way that we would expect at the higher proof with both the Irish and the American? And it actually did turn out that way.
Yeah.
What I loved about it is that, and it's the same, it's actually the same with the Keeper's Heart Irish plus American 110 proof, is that we worked on the basis that we have a blend in our Irish plus American and our Irish plus bourbon that people like. They love the flavor profile. They're enjoying what it delivers. But then you do have a cohort of people that do enjoy that higher proof whiskey. And you're right, it's more so in the American whiskey side of things that people prefer to delve into that higher proof whiskey. But what we found is that because of the influence of the Irish whiskey in both the Keeper's Heart Irish plus American 110 proof and the Irish plus bourbon cask strength, it actually doesn't drink like a regular 110 proof or 118 proof. And therefore, you've got a lot more people enjoying it than you would just your whiskey aficionados or your whiskey, your high proof whiskey lovers.
Yeah.
And we saw that when we first did the 110 proof. And then when we went with the Irish plus bourbon, we were saying that jump from 92 proof to 110 wasn't going to be sufficient to satisfy bourbon whiskey drinkers. So we said we would go to the cask strength. And I have to say, in terms of that 118 proof, you can drink this neat all day. And in terms of the impact on flavor, you would not know you're drinking 118 proof.
Well, so I poured the 92 before we got on, and then I went to the 118. Subtle differences, really, in all honesty. You're getting a little bit more, I'm going to call it maturity. It's probably the same whiskey, but like depth.
Exactly the same whiskey, exactly the same blend.
Depth of flavor, right? That's what I'll go with. It provides that a little bit more depth. Like it's got more punch, right? The oak is more oaky, the caramel's more caramel, the vanilla is more vanilla. Like that's really what you're getting. And that's why they're like, oh, well, there's no flavor in low proof whiskey. Well, this from working countless years in Irish whiskey, putting out 86 proof, whiskey. There's a ton of flavor. You got to be looking for the right flavors, and it's got to be mingled the correct way or blended the correct way to get it there.
It is. And like one of the things, the way I always describe the higher proof versions of Irish plus bourbon and the Irish plus American is that if you look at we'll call it our core, which is the Irish plus American and Irish plus bourbon, you consider them the Americano version.
Yeah.
Well, higher proof versions are the espresso versions. And what I mean by that is that you've got this full concentration of flavor more to the fore because it's at the higher proof.
Yeah.
But the beauty of the beauty of the use of the Irish whiskey in this blend as well, is that even at the higher proof, it still has this acceptable uh, warmth rather than a big burn. And that's definitely a lot down to the Irish whiskey influence, as opposed to it being 100% American whiskey.
No, I think that's a really beautiful way to put it, especially from a international perspective, right? Because your brand is not just uniquely American for Americans. It is uniquely world. It's a unique world whiskey, right? Because you're blending things that people know. Like Irish whiskey is the hottest thing right now. Like it's selling like hotcakes, and it's taking over the world. Like, so being able to have the hottest thing in America, bourbon, and then having Irish whiskey and then blending that together, taking it to Ireland. So like, let me go back to your trip. What was it like to be able to take that product to your friends, to your family, and allow them to try that? Like, what was their reaction? What was that like to say, this is what we've put together to kind of honor where I am now and where I came from?
It was actually quite nerve-wracking because we made a decision in late 2022 to launch Ireland in 2023. So basically, the week after Paddy's Day, we decided to launch Keeper's Heart in Ireland. And I remember, like, I had done so many tastings in the US, talking about these whiskeys, talking about that extra dimension of flavor and taste, and just talking through the whole story. I will never forget how nervous I was doing the first number of tastings in Ireland, because now I was back in my home place. I was back talking to people that that know me from working in the Irish whiskey industry for years. And I really didn't know what people would think. I had a feeling that people would get it, would understand it, would see that it's not a gimmick, would actually get that extra dimension of flavor. But you always have a concern. And the reaction we got was absolutely amazing. It really, truly was. So much so that we really felt that, by launching in Ireland, it wasn't just good enough for me to be coming back and forth every now and then in terms of helping grow the brand in Ireland. That's one of the reasons that we went and in search of having our international brand ambassador, which ultimately became Ger Garland. And, Ger brought massive credibility then after the launch in Ireland to be able to keep that momentum going, be it in different parts of the country, but also with whiskey societies, and really bring the kind of the story that we're trying to bring throughout the US, bring it to Ireland and keep that momentum going. And it really has been, for us, it's something that we've been very, very happy with. We also understand that, launching in Ireland is never going to be the difference between success and failure for this brand. But we want to go back to some of the roots from where we came from and showcase that this whiskey is appreciated in Ireland as well as in the US. And who knows from there,
Yeah. Well, and that's what, you brought him up. Like, we got to talk with him in his previous role, right? Like with he's a great storyteller. And
amazing.
And that is what this brand needs. Like from an international scale, like to take this to locals, to take this to people that may not know it or may not get bourbon because it's too harsh or whatever. He is a great storyteller with a great palate too. Like that's another thing that he can talk to you, and then he can show you the components. And so you can say, hey, you like this part of Irish whiskey and you like this part of Irish grain whiskey. Now all we did was this and here's how it weaves together. And the way you can demo your product to the consumer when you get sips to lips makes it a lot more approachable, especially from an international market, and having a great storyteller, which a lot of brands don't have. Like that's another thing. You all have someone that has done it for years. He, in my mind, I put him in the conversation with the Freddies of the Freddie Johnsons of the world, and the Craig from Dalmore and people like that. Like I put him in that type of category because he has that, he carries himself that way. And
he does. And but to your point, he has a fantastic way about him.
Yeah.
He's a great storyteller, but he has the credibility because of his palate as well, that people will listen to him and respect what he's saying and understand what he's saying.
Yeah.
You brought up a very good point as well about tasting the components. That has been something that we have done a lot throughout the launches of these whiskeys and throughout the education around these whiskeys, is that getting people to taste each of the components that are used in producing this blend of whiskey has given people the opportunity to understand and figure out where each of the flavors are coming from. And I think one of the beauties for us as well is that because we're so open and authentic about what we're doing, we have no problem telling people, because we're proud of where the whiskies are coming from in terms of the pot still and the grain whiskey is coming from Great Northern Distillery, and the rye and the bourbon are coming from MGP in Indiana. And like, to be able to showcase those quality whiskeys in their component form, it shows people that each of these components could actually be whiskeys on their own if they wanted to be.
Yeah.
So we're bringing great quality components together, and we're creating a unique style of whiskey with that whole unique delivery, both on mouthfeel and flavor, that, you know, really, really is showcasing that the overall blend is better than each of the individual components.
So, and you brought up a good point there, because you are transparent about that, and I love that. But the question begs, when is Keeper's Heart own whiskey? Because, like, Brian, you're a distiller at heart, right? Like,
yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So what's that look like?
What we're doing is, so we will continue to release Keeper's Heart Irish Plus American and Irish Plus Bourbon. And our intention at the moment is to continue to source those whiskeys, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then at the distillery, since September 2021, we've been laying down stocks of American whiskey made in the Irish style of triple copper pot distillation. So we've made an American single pot still, which is using that quintessential Irish mash bill of malted barley and unmalted barley, distilled it 3 times in copper pot stills, and Americanized it on the basis of maturing it in virgin American oak barrels. But because we did that, we've created a heavier style of pot distillate in order to be able to cope with the virgin American oak influence.
Yeah.
So that has been maturing away for the last number of years, and our intention will be to launch, the first release of that will be Q4 of 2025.
So we're not far away. So that's resting.
We're not far away,
but it's coming
which is amazing. And we could, like, the reality of it is we could release it this year, but I wanted to get to that 4 years before we do release it. Yeah. I mean, the flavor profile, the impact on the whiskey at the moment, we've tasted it. We've tasted it, and hopefully when you get to the distillery, you'll get to taste it yourself. We've tasted it with different people, and the reaction, as I always say, it's no point if we like it in the distillery, it's other people that are coming in that get to taste it. If they like it, well, that's a better signal for us than me or the rest of the team saying, oh, we love it. Mm-hmm. But the feedback has been really, really good. We're also producing a triple pot distilled rye and a triple pot distilled bourbon. So again, very, very unique whiskies that, you know, have not been released on the market before. So ultimately by 2027, there will be 5 core whiskies, being the Irish Plus American, the Irish Plus Bourbon, and then the American single pot still, triple pot still rye, and triple pot still bourbon, that really haven't been there in the market before on a scale that we're looking at doing, you know?
Yeah, because there's a brand that comes to mind, right, that has that kind of riffed off of that, but they're not doing what you're doing, right? And so I think that's really unique, right? Because Taonua comes to mind. That's done some really
cool
stuff.
Fantastic. In fairness to them, they're doing some fantastic work in terms of their triple pot distillation. They're a great bunch of people up in Colorado, and you know they've done a great job, and their whiskey quality is fantastic. We've met the guys, and they're really doing a great job.
Yeah, and so it's cool. Like, you know, you're bringing the the Irish way of doing it, which is cool because like it's a little bit different. And I love that you're sticking to the Irish roots, like the unmalted and the malted, right? Because my question was going to be, are you going to do an Irish single malt type deal? But obviously, you're going to stick to the Irish way of making the whiskey. So I'm interested. April 24th can't get here soon enough for me to visit the distillery.
We'll make sure there's plenty good distillates and maturing whiskey for you to taste as well that time, so you get to really see the impact, you know.
I'm excited. Don't you worry. I will be enjoying every moment of that when I'm there. The other question I have for you, right? So like, because Irish has gotten so big and you have Irish whiskey has gotten huge. It seems like that's all the numbers tell us that. Yeah. How do you temper expectations of like, you know, being a leader in that category for so long? How do you temper like people like, so what are you all going to do to kind of, you know, continue to bridge that gap, to continue to do that? Like, will you find other ways, other partnerships to build like a halo effect, right? For Keeper's Heart to build those interesting Irish brands in America that you might do, like a single malt or like an age stated Irish whiskey. Like, are those some ideas that you all have that may come to fruition?
Yeah. So like one of the things that we hope to, well, not that we hope, that we will actually be doing is we will be releasing some aged whiskey releases towards kind of Q3 and Q4 of this year. That will be very, there'll be a 21-year-old whiskey, there'll be a 32-year-old whiskey that ultimately will be in much smaller volumes that we have. But we've done some exciting finishes on the finish on the 21-year-old that I'm not going to get into now because I do want to keep it a little bit as a surprise.
Well, that's a second podcast. That's all that is. It's a second podcast.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
To be continued.
What I'm liking about it is that it has created an amazing whiskey. So we are going to do stuff like that. We also have a 10-year-old single pot still that was voted best Irish whiskey in 2023 by the International Spirits Competition in San Francisco, which again is a 10-year-old whiskey that we sourced from Great Northern Distillery. It's ex-Cooley stock, but we finished it in Malaga wine barrels for only 4 months. To make it our own, but also to bring a little bit of a heightened texture, because sometimes single malt whiskies can be that little bit drier on the palate.
Yeah.
So we wanted to bring a little bit of a honey-like texture to it, and then add some of the influence of the Malaga wine, but not overtake from that beautiful cereal biscuit fruity notes that you get from the malt whiskey. And it turned out to be really, really exceptional. And the awards that we got for it are really something that we're very proud of. Yeah. So we do tend to do some of that. Your other question in terms of a single malt on the American side is that is something that we will look at doing and will do, but we'll do it on a much smaller scale compared to our American single pot still, or a triple pot distilled rye, or triple pot distilled bourbon.
Yeah.
But one of the fortunate things that we have is we have a facility in Minneapolis that, you know, is really a state-of-the-art distillery, a lot of flexibility, and we're going to utilize that as much as we can to be as innovative, but not nutty professors where we ultimately are creating distillates that nobody will ever want to taste or see the light of day, you know. So you have to temper that type of innovative thinking to make sure that it's something that does have a real opportunity within the market, rather than going, oh, I just like this, let's just do it, you know.
Yeah, it's all got to be somewhat scalable, right? You have bosses that you have to report to.
Exactly.
And the bottom line is bottles go out and bottles get moved.
Yes.
So
yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, like we describe our facility, like as I said, we have a fantastic facility in Minneapolis, but it's actually 15,000 square feet of production, but 15,000 square feet of hospitality. But that hospitality space is there to really sell bottles of Keeper's Heart and to build the advocacy for Keeper's Heart. And ultimately, you hope that people that visit our facility leave as brand ambassadors for Keeper's Heart. Because
Yeah.
we can't do it on our own. We rely on our distributors. We rely on bartender advocacy. We rely on the people in the store to know the story and to sell it. Not because they like, it's to sell it because they believe in it as well.
Yeah.
And have that advocacy.
No, I think that's the key, right? You got to get people there, or you got to get the whiskey to them so that they can experience it and they can be telling their friends about it. Right. Yeah. I think that's the beauty of the community is once you find something you like, you tend to talk about it, whatever that is. I mean, I was a fan of the Irish plus American, but the Irish plus bourbon is you're speaking to my palate a little bit more.
Yeah.
And because I get a lot, like you mentioned, the Irish experience kind of comes through more on the Irish plus American. It's a little more tapered down. I still am acquiring an Irish palate, right? Like that's the other thing. Mm-hmm. Americans tend to do American things and they don't always drink world whiskeys. And that's been my challenge to myself as I go through this. Like I can't just drink American whiskey and think that my palate will be refined that way. No, I need to try Irish. I need to try Scotch. I need to, as much as I hate Islay Scotch, I need to try Islay Scotch. I need to try Taiwanese or Japanese or Indian, right? Because like you're going to get different flavor profiles, different context of like where the whiskey's aging, all these different things. And then that can help you appreciate, these types of unique blends. And that's why I was been able to pick out like that grain note because I drank some grain whiskey not too long ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's pretty cool.
I think so. But I also think that, to your point as well, is that people nowadays tend to want to experiment more.
Yeah.
Want to try something different. So the loyalty to be loyal to just one brand is beginning to shift. So you are seeing people that want to have different experiences and ultimately try different styles and different types of whiskey.
Yeah.
And I think that puts us in a very strong position in that respect, because this is something so unique and so different. The other side of it is when you look at the way the whiskey demographic has gone over the last 10 to 15 years, the way people enjoy their whiskey now compared to 10, 15 years ago has changed dramatically as well. So as much as the experimentation and trying different types, there's also the whole idea around mixology and developing whiskey and cocktails and long drinks, highballs and all of that. And one of the beauties that we find about these whiskeys is that they're quite versatile.
Yep.
And they do taste great neat on the rocks, but also work well in cocktails and are still the hero of the cocktail.
Yeah.
I mean, so many times you can get a cocktail where basically it's the bitters or the syrup is the hero of the cocktail. The whiskey is lost in it.
Yep.
I think with the slightly higher proofs, you're getting the opportunity to still have the whiskey as the hero in something like an old fashioned or a Manhattan. And we're finding that when we go to release the whiskey and go to different bars, we're finding that Keeper's Heart Irish plus American seems to be a good choice for the old fashioned, and the Irish plus bourbon is a good choice for the Manhattan. And we're seeing bartenders that are just trying it and doing it in their own ideas of their cocktails or the menus, and it's becoming quite successful.
Yeah, you got me my mind racing when you said highball. The Irish plus American and a highball.
Yeah,
with a little bit of that squeeze of lemon or lime, depending on what you want to do. That sounds really delightful with a little dash of simple in there to sweeten it up. That sounds really nice because it's already got some lime characteristics. It's got that citrus characteristic kind of going with it. So I think that's a really underplayed cocktail that people need to like pay more attention to. It's just a nice highball.
Oh, big time. And it's also, it's also very, very refreshing as well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I do enjoy a highball from time to time. And, I also use it as a means of enjoying my whiskey around friends that are drinking beer or something like that, because, you get the opportunity to experience a good whiskey in a highball, but you're not being left behind, or you're not ahead of all the people that are drinking with you drinking beer.
Yeah.
And I like that idea. I like to be able to kind of sip on a highball when people are enjoying a beer.
Yeah.
And the one thing about these whiskeys as well is that from the cocktail point of view, is the seasonality of it. I mean, a mule with the Irish Plus American, or a whiskey lemonade with the Irish Plus bourbon, again, very, very refreshing drinks during the summer, during the spring. So it's also trying to kind of remove the myth that whiskey is purely for a kind of a fall or a winter sense, or a winter season. You can actually have very, very refreshing drinks with whiskey, even in the spring and summer.
Yeah, sign me up. I'm a whiskey 24/7, 365 guy.
Yeah,
beer makes me feel terrible. Nothing wrong with beer, just makes me feel bad.
Yeah.
Whiskey doesn't make me feel bad, except when I have enjoyed responsibly for too long of a time. But man, like this is good. Like you gave me enough teas to like continue to keep on going. So I always like to shout out your all's PR team. So Colin and Colangelo are awesome. Thank you for them to being able to send over the whiskey so that we can have this conversation. They're the unsung heroes when it comes to setting up all this stuff on the back end. So
big time. Yeah.
Really appreciate
we're very
them.
happy to have them with us. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other big partners, thank you for joining us tonight, because it's always great to talk to you and pick your brain, because you've seen a lot, you're doing a lot, and you're bringing something unique to the marketplace, which I really appreciate, because I learn a ton every time I talk to you. So Brian, thanks for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it, man.
No problem at all. Thanks a million for having me on, and appreciate the support.
And as always, we have to end with sláinte instead of cheers.
Absolutely. Sláinte.
Sláinte. Brian, thank you. And thank you everybody for listening to this episode of the Bourbon Lens. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Bourbon Lens. Make sure you're connected with Scott and I via social media on Instagram, X, and Facebook. We'd love to connect. And if you're more the professional type, follow us over on LinkedIn. If you want to know more about Bourbon Lens, make sure you're subscribed to our weekly newsletter, The Weekly Pour. For exclusive content and more, check out Patreon. Follow us there at Bourbon Lens. And last but not least, on your favorite podcast listening app, make sure you're subscribed, because every Monday, Scott and I release a podcast, and we would love to have you here listening to the newest features and the newest whiskey news. And until next time, cheers.